We are back with a part 2 full of some of the most evil people I've ever heard of. Spoiler alert, they're all serial killers. Here is part 2 of the top 10 real people too evil for Alcatraz prison. Starting off at our number 10 spot, we have Scott Lee Kimball. This is a man who took the lives of at least 4 people between the years of 2003 and 2004, but I say the words "at least" because although it's never been proven, it is thought that he actually took the lives of somewhere around 20 plus people. During the first of the 2 crime-filled years, Scott actually worked as an FBI informant, but to none of our surprise now, he was one of the worst informants of all time. Not only did he rarely provide any sort of evidence that ended up being useful, but much of the evidence he did provide ended up later being proven false. He was caught in 2006 not only for these horrific crimes, but many others as well, which included things like fraud and forgery. He ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison, and he still is currently serving that sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have Maxim Petrov. Maxim was a Russian doctor who ended up being arrested in 2000. He was arrested for taking the lives of 17 people in just 1 year, which is so many. He did this through administering a sort of lethal drug combination. He didn't stop there though, because that would just be regular terrible. Instead, he then went on to rob his victims, and then he would set fire to their homes, which I assume would likely be to hide any evidence of his wrongdoings. So, all in all, just a real awful human being. In the end, he was caught, he stood trial, and was convicted to a life sentence. In the end, Maxim was believed to have committed 19 of these crimes, but he was only tried for 17 of them and was found guilty on 11 of the charges. In our number 8 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were women in vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were, quote, easy to pick, and that he, quote, hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So, all in all, just a horrible person. In our number 7 spot today, we have Wanlin, who started his life in jail in the early 1990s, and he was there as a result of human trafficking charges. Not a good start for sure, but this clearly did not stop him, as he decided, while still in jail, to start his own medical practice. Okay, didn't know it was that easy, but anyway. In 1997, after a retrial, Hu actually ended up being released from prison. Okay, so what's he gonna do with his newfound freedom? Well, he decided to just keep doing the thing he was doing in jail, which was running a sort of medical practice. You might be sitting there asking yourself, is he a doctor or some kind of medical practitioner? The answer is no. So for the next few years, Hu treated many people with an herbal remedy that actually contained sodium sulfate, which is lethal in large doses. It is suspected that because of this, he ended up taking the lives of about 146 people. He was arrested again in 1999 and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for practicing medicine without a license. Yeah, only 15 years. And then he was released early for good behavior. Shortly after his release in 2014, it is believed he was responsible for another death of a 22-year-old student. So at this point, I just don't even know. I don't know what to make of that. It's terrible. In our number 6 spot today, we have Viktor Sayenko. This terrible person is just one part of a group that is responsible for a string of killings in Ukraine that took place in June and July of 2007. In the end, he was charged with 29 separate incidents, 21 of which were killings, and the rest were incidents where the victims thankfully survived the horrendous attacks. Aside from just how tremendously terrible this entire thing was, the case gained a certain notoriety because of the fact that there was actually actually a recording of one of the crimes that leaked online. That is because the people committing these acts had intended to sell the videos of them being done, which is thought to be the biggest motivation for all of the crimes, but it has never been proven. In the end, he was found guilty of these crimes and is currently serving a life sentence. In our number 5 spot today, we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more came to light. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which is the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at that time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so let's hope that never happens ever. In our number 4 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade, he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling strip clubs at night looking for the next person to take. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Polson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 3 spot today, we have Catherine Birnie. Back in the 1980s, Catherine and her husband David decided to go on a little spree that would see them taking the lives of 4 separate women. The pair would together kidnap the women, bring them back to their home where the rest of the crimes would take place. In the end, the pair was caught due to their 5th victim, who thankfully was able to escape. She went right to the police and was able to lead them directly to the home of these terrible people. Both of these 2 were sentenced to 4 terms of life in prison, and based on laws at the time, this meant that they had to serve at least 20 years before being eligible for parole. In 2005, David ended up taking his own life in jail, and while Catherine has applied for parole a few times, in 2009 it was determined that she will never be allowed to be released, making her only the 3rd female in Australian history to have her papers marked this way. In our number 2 spot today, we have Robledo Puch. This man is a serial killer from Argentina who is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 11 people, as well as a series of robberies, kidnapping, and more terrible things that we can't even talk about here on YouTube. In the end, because of a blunder in the middle of a crime where he not only killed his own accomplice, but then failed to remove his own identification from his now dead accomplice's pocket, thus basically placing him at the scene of the crime, he ended up being caught and arrested. He ended up being sentenced to life in prison. These crimes took place in 1972, and while he did become eligible for parole in 2000, he still remains in jail to this day and is one of the longest serving prisoners in Argentina ever. In our number 1 spot today, we have Adnan Colak. This Turkish serial killer is responsible for taking the lives of 11 women who were between the ages of 68 and 95. He also was responsible for 6 other crimes that were against elderly women, so really just the worst of the worst. Anyway, he ended up being caught for his crimes and was sentenced to 6 death sentences as well as 40 years in prison. This was back in 1995 when he was first sentenced, but in 2004 the death penalty in Turkey was abolished, which then commuted his sentence to life in prison. I truly wish this was where the story ended, but it is not. No, instead, in May of 2005, Adnan was actually released from jail. I wish I was joking, but that would be a very weird joke to make, and unfortunately it's just the truth. There was some sort of conditional release agreement that was called the Rasan Amnesty, so somehow this guy just got released. I don't know. Again, I hate it. It happens, and I don't know what to do about it, okay? Guys, that's been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski. Let me know if you want a part 3. It's terrible, but Sometimes we just gotta hear about these terrible things, you know? Let me know if you want that. Sorry, that was dark and sad. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Bye.